The morning Emma discovered the truth, frost still clung to the windows of their Seattle penthouse like broken promises. She stood in the marble kitchen, coffee growing cold in her hands, staring at the credit card statement that had arrived in yesterday's mail. 3 months of charges she'd never made, hotels she'd never seen, restaurants where she'd never dined. Her husband Marcus had been careful about everything except this one oversight. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The golden retriever at her feet whined softly, sensing the shift in the air that dogs always seem to detect before humans caught up. Emma reached down to scratch behind Honey's ears, the simple gesture grounding her as her world tilted on its axis. 15 years of marriage, and she was discovering it had been alive for at least half of that time. Marcus found her there an hour later, still standing in the same spot, still holding the statement. He took one look at her face and knew. No explanations, no denials, just a heavy sigh that carried the weight of a man who'd been caught and was almost relieved. "How long?" Emma asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Does it matter?" The casual dismissal hit her like a physical blow. Not the affairs themselves, but the indifference. The way he looked at her like she was an inconvenience, a problem to be managed rather than a person whose heart was shattering. "Pack what you need," she said quietly. "I want you gone by tonight." Marcus laughed, actually laughed. "Emma, be realistic. This is my condo, my life. You don't work, you don't contribute anything meaningful. Where exactly do you think you're gonna go?" The word should have destroyed her. 6 months ago they would have. But something had changed in Emma during those quiet months while Marcus traveled for business. During those long evenings when she'd felt more alone in his presence than she ever had by herself. She'd started remembering who she used to be before she became Mrs. Marcus Sullivan. Emma's hands didn't shake as she pulled the emergency credit card from her wallet, the one account Marcus had never bothered to monitor because it was in her maiden name. The account she'd been quietly feeding with small amounts over the past year, some instinct preparing for a disaster she hadn't wanted to name. "Watch me," she said. By sunset, Emma's Honda CR-V was packed with everything that mattered. Honey's bed and toys occupied the back seat, along with 2 suitcases and a box of photographs from the life she'd had before. Marcus convinced her she didn't need friends or hobbies or dreams of her own. The most important item was tucked in her glove compartment. A letter from her great-aunt Rose, who'd died 3 months earlier and left Emma something Marcus knew nothing about. The letter had arrived the day after the funeral, hand-delivered by a lawyer who'd seemed almost apologetic about the unusual request. Rose had left Emma her ranch in Montana, along with enough money to keep it running for exactly 1 year. "If you're reading this," the letter said in Rose's familiar handwriting, "then you're probably in need of somewhere to start over. The ranch isn't much, but it's honest land, and sometimes that's all we need." Emma had hidden the letter, telling herself she'd never need it. But Rose had known her better than she'd known herself. The drive to Montana took 3 days. Emma stopped in small motels that welcomed dogs, ate fast food meals while Honey explored rest areas, and slowly felt the tight knot in her chest begin to loosen. Each mile between her and Seattle was a mile towards something she couldn't name, but desperately needed. The GPS led her down increasingly narrow roads until she was driving on gravel, then dirt, through landscape that rolled endlessly under a sky bigger than any she'd ever seen. When she finally saw the weathered wooden sign that read Sunset Creek Ranch, Emma pulled over and sat for a long moment, engine idling. The ranch house was smaller than she'd expected, with a wraparound porch and shutters that needed painting. The barn behind it leaned slightly to the left, and the fencing around the property was held together with determination and hope rather than proper maintenance. But there was something about the place that spoke to a part of Emma's soul she'd forgotten existed. Honey bounded out of the car the moment Emma opened the door, immediately beginning an inspection of her new territory with the thorough enthusiasm only a dog could muster. Emma stood beside the car, breathing air that tasted of sage and possibility, watching her dog discover the joy of wide open spaces. "You must be Emma." She turned to find a man walking toward her from the direction of the barn. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it, and jeans that had clearly seen honest work. His face was weathered by sun and wind, and when he smiled, it crinkled the corners of his eyes in a way that suggested he did it often. "I'm Caleb Morrison," he said, extending a hand that was calloused and warm. "I've been looking after the place since Rose passed." "Been waiting for you to show up?" Emma shook his hand, acutely aware of how soft her own hands felt against his. "I wasn't sure I was coming until 3 days ago. Sometimes the best decisions are the ones we don't overthink." Caleb's voice carried a slight drawl that spoke of roots planted deep in this soil. "Rose always said you'd find your way here when you were ready." They walked toward the house together, Honey bounding ahead to investigate everything with tireless curiosity. Caleb pointed out the basics as they went. The well was good. The septic system had been updated 5 years ago. The roof was sound but would need attention before the next hard winter. "What about the animals?" Emma asked, remembering the lawyer's mention of livestock. Caleb's grin widened. "That's where things get interesting. Rose left you quite a menagerie. There's a small herd of cattle, some chickens, 2 horses that are too old to be useful, but too sweet to sell, and—" He paused, and Emma caught something almost mischievous in his expression. "The goats." "Goats?" 37 of them, last count. Rose rescued them from a farm that was closing down. "They're good animals, but they need daily attention. Feeding, milking the does, general care." Caleb stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "I've been handling it since Rose died, but I've got my own ranch to run 5 miles down the road. Can't keep doing both forever." Emma felt something sink in her stomach. She'd never taken care of any animal more demanding than Honey, and even that had been with Marcus constantly criticizing her methods. "I don't know anything about goats," she admitted. "Most people don't, until they do." Caleb studied her face with eyes that were surprisingly kind. "Tell you what, you're obviously tired from the drive, and there's a lot to take in. Why don't you get settled tonight, and we can talk about the animals tomorrow?" But Emma could see something in his expression, a careful politeness that hadn't been there before. The reality was settling in for both of them. City woman with no experience, overwhelming responsibility, the likelihood that she'd be gone within a month. "You think I can't do it," she said. Caleb was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I think you're dealing with a lot right now. And I think taking care of livestock is harder than most people realize, especially when you're starting from scratch." Emma felt the familiar sting of being underestimated, the echo of every time Marcus had dismissed her capabilities. But this was different. Caleb wasn't being cruel or condescending. He was being realistic, and that somehow stung worse. "What happens to them if I can't manage it?" she asked. "We'd have to sell them off. Some might go to good homes, others—" He shrugged, but Emma could read between the lines. That night, Emma sat on the porch steps with Honey pressed warm against her side, listening to sounds she'd never heard before. The lowing of cattle in the distance, the rustle of wind through grass that went on for miles, the profound quiet that existed only in places where human noise didn't dominate every moment. The house was basic but clean, furnished with pieces that had clearly been chosen for durability rather than style. Rose's personality lingered in small touches, quilts folded over chair backs, books stacked on every available surface, photographs of the ranch through different seasons clustered on the mantelpiece. Emma found a journal on the kitchen table with a note attached. "For Emma, everything I learned about this place is in here. The land will teach you the rest. Love, Aunt Rose." She opened it to find pages of careful handwriting detailing everything from the best places to find wildflowers to the feeding schedules for each type of animal. Rose had documented the personality of individual goats, noting that Gertie was the herd leader and that Bruno had a tendency to escape if the gate wasn't properly latched. Reading Rose's words, Emma felt the weight of what had been entrusted to her. This wasn't just property, it was a legacy. These animals had been Rose's companions, her responsibility, her joy, and now they were Emma's. But as she read about grain mixtures and vaccination schedules, about the seasonal rhythms that governed ranch life, Emma felt the familiar creep of panic. What had she been thinking? She was a city woman whose greatest agricultural achievement had been keeping a few houseplants alive. How could she possibly manage all of this? Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Come home, we can work this out." Emma stared at the message for a long time before deleting it without responding. Home. The word felt strange now. The penthouse had never been home, just a beautiful cage she'd decorated to her captor's specifications. But this place, with its honest wear and overwhelming responsibility, didn't feel like home either. Not yet. She woke before dawn to unfamiliar sounds. Honey was already alert, ears pricked toward the windows. Outside, Emma could hear what sounded like a small riot in progress. Bleating, shuffling, the unmistakable sound of animals who expected their breakfast and weren't interested in waiting. Emma pulled on jeans and boots, grateful for the practical clothes she'd impulsively packed, and followed the noise toward the barn. In the early morning light, she got her first real look at Rose's goats. They were every size and color imaginable, from tiny Nigerian dwarves to larger Nubians with their distinctive long ears. They pressed against the fence of their pen, a sea of expectant faces and urgent bleats. Honey approached cautiously, tail wagging but clearly uncertain about these strange new creatures. Overwhelming, isn't it? Emma turned to find Caleb approaching with 2 steaming cups of coffee. He was dressed for work in worn jeans and a flannel shirt, his hair still damp like he'd just showered. "I brought caffeine," he said, offering her a cup. "Figured you might need it." The coffee was strong and perfect, warming Emma's hands through the ceramic mug. "How did you know I'd be up?" "The goats don't believe in sleeping in. They've been calling for breakfast for the past 20 minutes. Caleb nodded toward the pen where the animals were becoming increasingly vocal about their needs. "They're used to being fed at dawn." Emma watched the goats with a mixture of fascination and terror. There are so many of them. Rose loved everyone. Caleb's voice carried genuine affection. Started with 3 that someone couldn't care for anymore. Within 5 years, she had the whole herd. Couldn't resist a goat in need. And now, they're my responsibility. Caleb was quiet for a moment, sipping his coffee and studying Emma's profile. They don't have to be. Emma looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "I meant what I said yesterday. This is a big undertaking for someone without experience. There's no shame in recognizing that it's not for you." His voice was gentle but honest. "I could help you find good homes for most of them. Make some calls, reach out to people I know who might be interested. You think I should give up. I think you should be realistic about what you're taking on." Emma felt something flare in her chest, not quite anger, but close to it. What if I don't want to be realistic? What if I want to try? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Caleb turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Then I'll help you. But I need to know you're committed, because these animals deserve consistency. They've already lost Rose. They can't go through another abandonment." The weight of his words settled over Emma like a challenge. These weren't just animals. They were living beings who'd already experienced loss and disruption. If she took this on, she owed them everything she had. "What would it involve?" she asked. "Everything. Feeding twice a day, milking the does, monitoring their health, maintaining their shelter, making sure they have fresh water, rotating their grazing areas." Caleb's voice was matter-of-fact. "It's 7 days a week, no vacations, no sleeping in, no calling in sick. They depend on you completely." Emma thought about her old life, where her biggest daily decision was which yoga class to attend or what to order for lunch. This was the opposite of that existence in every possible way. "How long would you help me?" "As long as it takes for you to learn. Could be weeks, could be months." Caleb paused, then added, "But you have to really want to do it, Emma. I can teach you the mechanics, but I can't want it for you." Emma looked out at the goats, who had settled into a patient but expectant huddle near the gate. One small black and white doe had separated from the group and was watching Emma with what looked like curiosity rather than demand. "That's Daisy," Caleb said, following her gaze. She was Rose's favorite, raised her from a bottle when her mother rejected her. As if hearing her name, Daisy approached the fence and pressed her nose through the wire mesh toward Emma. Without thinking, Emma reached out to touch the soft muzzle. and Daisy nuzzled her palm with surprising gentleness. "She likes you," Caleb observed. "That's a good sign." Daisy was always a good judge of character, according to Rose. Emma felt something shift inside her as she looked into Daisy's intelligent brown eyes. It wasn't love at first sight exactly, but it was recognition. These animals needed her, and for the first time in years, Emma felt needed for something that mattered. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." Emma straightened her shoulders, feeling the weight of the decision settle into her bones. "I want to try. I want to learn how to take care of them." Caleb studied her face for a long moment, and Emma had the feeling he was seeing more than she'd intended to show. Finally, he nodded. "All right then, but I have conditions." "Name them. You stick with it for at least 6 months. No matter how hard it gets. No matter how tired or frustrated or overwhelmed you feel. 6 months of honest effort." Emma thought about Marcus's dismissive words, about everyone who'd ever assumed she wasn't capable of real commitment or hard work. "Deal. And you do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you, until you know enough to make your own decisions. No shortcuts, no I know better moments. These animals' lives depend on getting it right." "Understood." Caleb's serious expression cracked into the beginning of a smile. "Then let's go feed some goats." The next hour was a crash course in controlled chaos. Caleb showed Emma how to prepare the grain mixture, explaining the ratios and nutritional needs with the patience of someone who genuinely loved teaching. The goats' excitement grew as they recognized the sound of grain being poured, their bleats becoming more urgent and demanding. "The trick," Caleb said, opening the gate with practiced ease, "is not to let them overwhelm you. They're pushy when they're hungry, but they're not mean. Just enthusiastic." Emma stepped into the pen and was immediately surrounded by a sea of goats, all convinced she was personally responsible for their breakfast. They pressed against her legs, stood on their hind legs to get her attention, filled the air with urgent conversation. "Don't panic," Caleb called, his voice amused. "They're just saying hello." Emma tried to follow his instructions for distributing the grain evenly, but the goats had their own ideas about the process. The larger ones pushed forward aggressively, while the smaller ones darted between legs and around bodies, trying to claim their share. It was loud and chaotic and completely overwhelming. And then Daisy appeared at Emma's elbow, somehow having navigated through the crowd without getting trampled. She didn't push or shove like the others, just waited patiently until Emma noticed her and offered her a handful of grain. "Smart girl," Caleb said approvingly. "She knows the squeaky wheel doesn't always get the grease." As the feeding frenzy calmed and the goats settled into eating, Emma had a chance to observe them more carefully. Each had distinct personality traits that became apparent once she stopped seeing them as an undifferentiated mass. Some were bold and pushy, others shy and cautious. Some ate quickly and efficiently, others savored every bite. A few seemed more interested in investigating Emma than in eating their breakfast. "How do you tell them apart?" she asked, watching a group of brown goats that looked nearly identical to her untrained eye. "Time and attention," Caleb replied. Rose could identify every animal from across the pasture. She knew their individual quirks, their health histories, their relationships with each other. It becomes second nature, after a while. Emma doubted she'd ever reach that level of expertise, but she found herself already beginning to notice differences. The way one goat held her head high and proud, while another kept her attention focused on the ground. The social dynamics that determined who got the best spots at the feed trough. "What's next?" she asked as the goats finished eating and began to disperse around the pen. "Milking," Caleb said. "We've got 6 does in production right now. It needs to be done twice a day, morning and evening, at consistent times." The milking parlor was a small, clean room attached to the barn, with stations designed to make the process efficient. Caleb brought in the first doe, a large Nubian named Bessie, who stepped onto the platform and immediately buried her nose in a bucket of grain. "The key is keeping them calm and content," Caleb explained, settling onto a low stool beside Bessie. "Most goats actually enjoy being milked once they're used to the routine. It relieves the pressure. and they get treats during the process. Emma watched as Caleb's experienced hands worked with quiet efficiency. The milk flowed steadily into the stainless steel bucket, and Bessie continued munching her grain with evident satisfaction. "Your turn," he said, standing and offering Emma the stool. Emma's first attempts were clumsy and frustrating. Her hands cramped, her technique was all wrong, and Bessie grew restless with the inexperienced handling. But Caleb was patient, adjusting her grip, showing her the proper rhythm, encouraging her when she got discouraged. "It's like learning to ride a bike," he said. Frustrating at first. Then suddenly it clicks. By the fourth dough, Emma was beginning to find the rhythm. Her hands were sore, and her back ached from the unfamiliar position, but there was something deeply satisfying about the work. The warm weight of the animal beside her, the steady stream of milk in the bucket, the quiet contentment of a job being done well. "Not bad for a first day," Caleb said as they finished with the last dough. "Your hands will toughen up in a few weeks." Emma looked down at her palms, already showing the beginnings of blisters that would become calluses. Physical evidence of work that mattered, of competence being earned rather than assumed. "What time do we do this again?" "Evening milking is at 6. I'll be here to help you through the routine until you're comfortable on your own." Caleb paused, then added, "Are you sure about this, Emma? I can see you're trying hard, but this is just the easy part. Wait until you're dealing with sick animals at 3 in the morning, or trying to catch an escaped goat in a thunderstorm." Emma thought about the question seriously. Her body was already sore from the morning's work, and she could see the overwhelming scope of what she'd committed to. But she also felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of being genuinely useful, of being needed for her capabilities rather than her appearance or social connections. "I'm sure," she said. "I want to learn to do this right." Caleb studied her face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, then. Tomorrow we'll start on basic health monitoring and pasture management." "And Emma?" "Yeah?" "Rose would be proud. This place means something again." As Emma watched Caleb walk back toward his truck, she felt the weight of those words settle into her chest. For the first time since leaving Seattle, she felt like she might actually be capable of building something worthwhile here. Honey appeared at her side, tail wagging, and Emma realized her dog had spent the morning making friends with several of the smaller goats. There was something poetic about that, she thought. All of them starting over in this place, learning new ways to belong. The rest of the day passed in a blur of discovery and overwhelming information. Emma explored the ranch with Rose's journal as her guide, trying to match the described locations with what she could see. The pastures where the goats rotated their grazing, the vegetable garden that had gone wild but still showed signs of careful planting, the chicken coop where a dozen hens clucked and scratched with regal confidence. Everything needed attention. The fencing required repair, the barn needed cleaning and organization, the equipment shed was full of tools she didn't recognize for tasks she didn't understand. But rather than feeling discouraged, Emma felt energized by the scope of the challenge. This was the opposite of her marriage, where her contributions had been diminished and dismissed. Here, everything she learned to do well would make a real difference. The animals would be healthier, the property would be more beautiful, the legacy Rose had built would continue to flourish. As afternoon faded toward evening, Emma heard the familiar sound of Caleb's truck returning for the evening milking. She'd spent the intervening hours reading Rose's journal and making lists of questions, trying to absorb as much information as possible before their next session. "Ready for round 2?" Caleb asked as he approached the barn. "I think so. I've been studying." This time, the milking went more smoothly. Emma's hand remembered some of what they'd learned that morning, and the does seemed more accepting of her presence. She was still slow and occasionally clumsy, but there were moments when the rhythm felt natural, when she could feel herself beginning to understand the work better. Caleb said as they finished with the last animal, "You're starting to relax. They can sense tension, so the calmer you are, the easier it goes." As they cleaned the equipment and secured the milking parlor for the night, Emma found herself reluctant to see Caleb leave, not because she was attracted to him, though she was beginning to admit that his quiet competence and patient teaching style appealed to her, but because his presence made the overwhelming scope of her new life feel manageable. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked as they walked toward his truck. Every day, he confirmed. Rain or shine. Weekends and holidays. Animals don't understand human schedules. After he left, Emma sat on the porch with Honey and watched the sun set over her new domain. The goats had settled into their evening routine, some grazing peacefully, while others engaged in the complex social interactions that seemed to occupy much of their time. The cattle were dark shapes in the distance, and somewhere nearby a barn owl called to its mate. For the first time in years, Emma felt the deep tiredness that came from meaningful work. Her muscles ached in new places, her hands were sore, and she faced a learning curve that seemed almost vertical. But she also felt more like herself than she had since before her marriage. Marcus had been wrong about her. She wasn't weak or dependent or incapable of contributing something meaningful to the world. She was scared and inexperienced and completely out of her depth, but she was also determined to prove that she could do this. The goats were counting on her. Rosa's legacy was in her hands. And for the first time in her adult life, Emma felt worthy of that trust. As she finally headed inside to make dinner, Emma caught sight of her reflection in the kitchen window. The woman looking back at her had dirt under her fingernails, hay in her hair, and the beginning of what would probably be an impressive collection of bruises and scratches. But her eyes were bright with purpose, and her shoulders were straight with newfound confidence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, new opportunities to prove herself. But tonight, Emma fell asleep to the sound of contented animals and the vast silence of open country, dreaming of morning milking and the patient brown eyes of a goat named Daisy, who had somehow decided she was worth trusting. The transformation had begun, though Emma didn't fully realize it yet. In choosing to stay and fight for something that mattered, she'd taken the first step toward becoming the woman Rose had always believed she could be. And in Caleb, she'd found not just a teacher, but someone who saw her potential even when she couldn't see it herself. But the real test was still to come. Learning to milk goats and distribute grain was just the beginning. Soon, Emma would face the deeper challenges of ranch life. Sick animals, equipment failures, financial pressures, and the 100 small crises that tested a person's resolve and revealed their true character. For now, though, she slept peacefully in Rose's bed, surrounded by the gentle sounds of a ranch at rest, while 37 goats dreamed their goat dreams and trusted that tomorrow would bring the same caring hands and patient presence they'd learned to expect. The broken heart she'd arrived with was still broken, but it was beginning to heal in the way that only meaningful work and genuine purpose could provide. And though she didn't know it yet, the cowboy who'd offered to teach her was beginning to see past her city, polished to the strength underneath, the same strength Rose had recognized years ago when she'd written her will with such specific and hopeful intentions. The story was just beginning, but already Emma could feel the pull of this place. The way it demanded everything while promising the chance to become more than she'd ever imagined possible. Tomorrow would test that resolve, and the day after that, and the day after that. But tonight, she was exactly where she needed to be. 3 weeks into her new life, Emma woke to the sound of frantic bleating that pierced through the pre-dawn darkness like an alarm. This wasn't the usual morning chorus demanding breakfast, but something urgent and wrong that sent her heart racing before she was fully conscious. Honey was already at the bedroom window, whining softly and pawing at the glass. Emma pulled on clothes in the darkness and grabbed the flashlight Caleb had insisted she keep by her bed. Outside, the air was sharp with the promise of winter, and her breath formed white clouds as she hurried toward the goat pen. The bleating grew louder as she approached, coming from the far corner where a cluster of animals had gathered. In the beam of her flashlight, Emma found Daisy lying on her side, flanks heaving with labored breathing. The other goats pressed close, their usual playfulness replaced by an anxiety that was almost human in its intensity. Emma's hands shook as she knelt beside the small black and white doe, remembering Caleb's warnings about emergencies and her own inexperience. Her fingers fumbled with her phone as she called Caleb's number, praying he would answer despite the early hour. He picked up on the second ring, his voice immediately alert. "What's wrong?" "It's Daisy. She's on the ground and breathing hard, and I don't know what to do." Emma's voice cracked with panic. The other goats are all gathered around her like they know something's wrong. "I'm on my way. Don't try to move her. Just stay with her and keep her calm. Talk to her. Let her know you're there." Emma sat in the dirt beside Daisy, one hand resting gently on the goat's neck, feeling the rapid flutter of her pulse. "It's okay, girl," she whispered, though her own voice betrayed her fear. "Caleb's coming. He'll know what to do." The minutes stretched endlessly until she heard the rumble of Caleb's truck turning into the drive. He appeared in the pen, carrying a large bag and a powerful battery-powered lantern that flooded the area with bright light. His hair was disheveled from sleep, but his movements were purposeful and calm. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, kneeling beside Emma and running experienced hands over Daisy's body. "I don't know. The noise woke me up maybe 10 minutes ago." Caleb's examination was thorough and gentle, checking Daisy's eyes, feeling her abdomen, listening to her breathing. Emma watched his face, trying to read the diagnosis in his expression. "Bloat," he said finally. "Her stomach's distended with gas. Probably got into something she shouldn't have, or ate too much of the wrong thing too fast." He looked up at Emma, his eyes serious but not panicked. "It's treatable, but we need to act quickly." Emma felt relief and terror in equal measure. Treatable meant Daisy might be okay, but the urgency in Caleb's voice suggested how easily things could go wrong. "What can I do?" "Hold her steady while I work." "And Emma?" He met her eyes directly. "This is part of it. The hard part one warned you about. Animals get sick, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes when you're least prepared for it." As Caleb worked with quiet efficiency, administering medication and monitoring Daisy's condition, Emma found herself thinking about the conversations they'd had over the past weeks. He'd been preparing her for moments like this, teaching her not just the daily routines but the deeper responsibilities of caring for living creatures who depended entirely on her competence and commitment. "She's responding," Caleb said after what felt like hours but had probably been less than one. Daisy's breathing was becoming less labored, and she had lifted her head to look around at her concerned audience. "The medication's working." Emma felt tears she hadn't realized she'd been holding back spill down her cheeks. "Is she going to be okay?" "Should be. We'll need to monitor her closely for the next few days, adjust her diet, make sure this doesn't happen again." Caleb sat back on his heels, studying Emma's tear-streaked face. "You did good, calling right away and staying calm with her." "I wasn't calm. I was terrified." "But you did what needed doing anyway. That's what matters." As dawn broke over the ranch, Emma found herself looking at everything differently. The weight of responsibility felt heavier now that she'd faced the possibility of losing an animal under her care. But she also felt something new, a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. "I need to learn more," she said as they walked back toward the house, Daisy now stable and resting comfortably. "About animal health, emergency care, all of it. I can't go through that again feeling so helpless." Caleb stopped walking and turned to face her. "That was your first real test. How do you feel about continuing with this?" Emma considered the question seriously. The night had been frightening and exhausting, and she knew there would be more emergencies, more moments when an animal's life hung in the balance of her knowledge and quick thinking. But she also knew that walking away now would mean abandoning not just the goats, but the person she was becoming. "More determined," she said finally. "Daisy trusted me to take care of her. They all do. I need to be worthy of that trust." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, a look of respect that hadn't been there before. "All right then, we'll expand your education. But first, you need some sleep. I'll stay and monitor Daisy for a few more hours." Emma wanted to protest that she could handle the monitoring herself, but exhaustion was beginning to catch up with her. "Thank you. For coming, for knowing what to do, for teaching me." "That's what neighbors do," Caleb said simply, but his eyes held something warmer than mere neighborliness. The weeks that followed brought an intensity to Emma's education that matched her newfound determination. Caleb arrived earlier and stayed later, teaching her to recognize the subtle signs of illness, the body language that indicated pain or distress, the preventative measures that could avoid crises before they developed. Emma's hands grew steadier and more confident. She learned to give injections, to trim hooves, to assist with difficult births when 2 more does kitted in late autumn. Each skill felt like a victory. Each successful intervention, a step toward becoming the rancher Rose had believed she could be. But it wasn't just the technical knowledge that was changing Emma. The physical demands of the work were transforming her body, building muscle and endurance she'd never possessed. Her skin grew weathered from sun and wind, her hands permanently marked with small cuts and calluses that spoke of honest labor. More importantly, she was discovering parts of herself that had been dormant during her marriage. Decision-making abilities that Marcus had never allowed her to develop. Physical strength that had been unnecessary in her pampered city life. A capacity for fierce dedication that surprised even her. "You're getting good at this," Caleb observed one afternoon as Emma successfully treated a minor injury on one of the young bucks. Rose would be proud. Emma felt the familiar warmth that came with his praise, but it was complicated now by something else she was trying not to acknowledge. Over the weeks of working together, she'd become increasingly aware of Caleb as more than just her teacher and neighbor. She noticed the way he moved with unconscious grace around the animals, his natural authority that never needed to be enforced through force or intimidation. She was drawn to his patient teaching style, the way he corrected her mistakes without making her feel foolish, the quiet confidence that made difficult tasks seem manageable. But Emma was wary of her own feelings. Her judgment about men had been so catastrophically wrong with Marcus that she didn't trust her instincts. And Caleb had never given her any indication that he saw her as anything more than Rose's inexperienced heir who needed guidance. Their relationship remained carefully professional, though Emma sometimes caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. When their hands brushed passing tools, or when he steadied her during a particularly challenging procedure, she felt electricity that seemed to go unnoticed on his side. Emma told herself it was better this way. She needed to focus on learning, on proving herself capable of managing the ranch independently. Romance would only complicate things, especially with someone whose respect she was still earning. But late at night, lying in Rose's bed and listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into sleep, Emma found herself thinking about Caleb's rare smiles, the way his voice softened when he talked about the animals, the strength in his hands when he demonstrated a new technique. The first snow arrived in early December, transforming the ranch into a winter wonderland that was beautiful and challenging in equal measure. Emma learned new routines for cold weather care, ensuring the animals had adequate shelter and unfrozen water, adjusting feed rations to help them maintain body heat. "Winter's when you really learn what you're made of," Caleb said as they broke ice on water troughs one bitter morning. "Summer ranching is hard work. Winter ranching tests your commitment." Emma was beginning to understand what he meant. Every task took longer in the cold and snow. Equipment that worked perfectly in temperate weather became stubborn and unreliable. The animals required more attention and care to stay healthy and comfortable. But there was something magical about the ranch in winter that spoke to Emma's soul. The way morning light turned fresh snow into diamonds scattered across the pastures. The peaceful quiet that settled over the land when storm clouds gathered. The cozy warmth of the barn during evening chores, filled with the contented sounds of well-cared-for animals. Emma was measuring grain for the morning feeding when she heard unfamiliar voices outside the barn. Through the window, she saw an expensive SUV parked beside Caleb's truck and two people in city clothes talking to him with animated gestures. She couldn't hear the conversation, but Caleb's body language was tense in a way she'd never seen before. He kept glancing toward the barn, and Emma had the uncomfortable feeling that whatever was being discussed involved her. When the visitors finally left and Caleb entered the barn, his expression was carefully neutral in a way that immediately put Emma on alert. "Who were they?" she asked. "Developers. They've been buying up ranches in the area, subdividing them for vacation homes and retirement communities." Caleb's voice was flat, but Emma could hear the anger underneath. "They made an offer on your place." Emma felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the winter weather. How did they even know about my inheritance? Small town. Word gets around when property changes hands, especially when it's someone from outside. Caleb began helping her distribute grain, but his movements were sharp with suppressed emotion. "They think you'll get tired of ranch life and want to cash out." "What kind of offer?" "Enough to set you up comfortably somewhere else. More than the place is worth as working ranch land." Emma absorbed this information in silence, watching Caleb's face for clues about what he was thinking. His expression gave away nothing, but she could feel the tension radiating from him. "And you think I should consider it?" she said finally. Caleb stopped what he was doing and looked at her directly. "I think you should do whatever's best for you. This life isn't easy, Emma. You've had a few months to get a taste of it, but you haven't been through a full year yet. Haven't dealt with market crashes that make it impossible to turn a profit, or droughts that kill your pastures, or disease outbreaks that can wipe out a whole herd overnight. His words stung because they echoed her own fears, the doubts that crept in during the hardest days when everything seemed to go wrong at once. "You don't think I can handle it," she said, and heard the defensiveness in her own voice. "I think you're stronger than you know. But I also think you deserve to make an informed decision about what you want your life to look like." Emma turned away from him, focusing on the goats who were pressing against the pen fence with their usual breakfast enthusiasm. But she could feel Caleb watching her, waiting for some response that she didn't know how to give. The truth was that the developer's offer represented safety and security, a return to the kind of comfortable life she'd known before everything fell apart. No more worrying about sick animals or equipment failures or whether she was competent enough to keep living creatures healthy and safe. But it also represented giving up on the person she was becoming, abandoning the animals who'd learned to trust her, walking away from the first meaningful work she'd ever done. "I need to think about it," she said finally. Caleb nodded, though Emma thought she caught a flicker of disappointment in his expression. "Of course. It's a big decision." The rest of the morning passed in uncomfortable silence. Emma went through the motions of her routine, but her mind was churning with possibilities and fears. Caleb helped as usual, but there was a distance between them that hadn't been there before. After he left, Emma sat in Rose's kitchen with honey at her feet and tried to imagine her life in 6 months, a year, 5 years from now. 2 paths stretched before her, each with its own risks and rewards. She could sell the ranch, take the developer's money, and return to a version of her old life. Maybe find a small apartment somewhere, get a job that used her college degree, try to rebuild some kind of normal existence. It would be safe and predictable, and free from the constant pressure of responsibility for living creatures. Or she could stay and commit fully to this life she was building, except that there would be more emergencies like Daisy's crisis. More moments when her inexperience could mean the difference between life and death for an animal under her care. Face the possibility that she might fail despite her best efforts, that the ranch might not be sustainable financially, or that she might discover she wasn't cut out for this kind of life after all. Emma pulled out Rose's journal and read her aunt's words about the challenges and rewards of ranch life, looking for guidance that only she could provide for herself. "The land doesn't care about your fears," Rose had written. "It only cares about your commitment. If you show up every day and do the work that needs doing, it will teach you everything you need to know. But you have to want to learn more than you want to be comfortable." That evening, Emma was late for milking because she'd been lost in thought, trying to work through the decision that felt too big for her to make alone. When she finally made it to the barn, she found Caleb already there with the first doe on the milking stand. "Sorry," she said, hurrying to take over. "I lost track of time." "It's fine," but his voice was cooler than usual, and Emma wondered if he'd interpreted her lateness as a sign that she was already mentally checking out. They worked in silence until Emma couldn't stand the tension any longer. "The developers want to turn it into vacation homes," she said abruptly. "Luxury cabins with mountain views and no working ranch anywhere in sight." Caleb's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their steady rhythm. "That's what they do. Buy up working land. Subdivide it. Market it to people who want to play cowboy on the weekends. You hate the idea. I hate watching this valley change. Used to be nothing but working ranches, as far as you could see. Now half of them are either abandoned or turned into weekend playgrounds for people who have no connection to the land." Caleb's voice carried a bitterness Emma had never heard before. "But it's not my decision to make." Emma heard the challenge in his words, the suggestion that she was just another outsider who would ultimately choose comfort and profit over commitment and hard work. "What if I don't want to sell?" "Then you don't sell." He shrugged as if it were that simple. "But you need to be sure, Emma, really sure, because this land and these animals deserve someone who's here for the long haul. And you don't think that's me." Caleb stopped milking and turned to face her directly. "I think you're city people who got dealt a bad hand and thought ranch life might be an interesting adventure. I think you're tougher than you know and smarter than you give yourself credit for. But I also think when push comes to shove, you'll choose security over uncertainty every time." His words hit like a physical blow because they contained enough truth to sting. Emma had chosen security when she'd married Marcus, accepting a comfortable cage rather than risking independence. She'd stayed in that marriage far longer than she should have, because leaving meant facing the unknown. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly. "Maybe I'm not cut out for this." Emma expected him to agree, to tell her that selling was probably the smart choice. Instead, Caleb's expression softened, and she saw something that looked like regret in his eyes. "I didn't mean it like that," he said. "I just don't want you to make this decision for the wrong reasons." "What would be the right reasons?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "Love, I guess. Love for the land, for the animals, for the work itself, not love of the idea of it, but love of the reality. The midnight emergencies and the equipment breakdowns and the years when you barely break even." Emma thought about Daisy's crisis, the terror and the relief, and the fierce protectiveness she'd felt. She thought about the satisfaction of successful milking, the pleasure of watching healthy animals graze in green pastures, the deep tiredness that came from meaningful work. "And if I don't know yet whether I love it enough, then maybe you need more time to find out." That night, Emma made 2 phone calls. The first was to the developers, telling them she wasn't interested in selling. The second was to her lawyer, asking about the terms of Rosa's will and whether there were any restrictions on her ownership. The next morning, she was waiting by the barn when Caleb arrived for feeding time. "I told them no," she said without preamble. Something shifted in Caleb's expression, surprise and what might have been relief. "You sure about that?" "No," Emma said honestly. "I'm not sure about anything, except that I'm not ready to give up yet. Rose left me this place for a reason, and I owe it to her and to myself to give it a real try." "And if it turns out you can't handle it?" Emma met his eyes steadily. "Then I'll fail honestly, trying to do something that matters, instead of succeeding at something safe and meaningless." For the first time in days, Caleb smiled, the expression transforming his entire face. Rose would have liked that answer. As they worked together that morning, Emma felt the distance between them beginning to close, but she also sensed a new quality to Caleb's attention, as if her decision to stay had changed something fundamental in how he saw her. "There's something I should tell you," he said as they finished milking. "The developers didn't just make you an offer, they made me one too." Emma felt her stomach drop. "For your ranch?" "For my services as a consultant. They want someone local to help them understand ranch operations, make their vacation homes feel authentic." Caleb's voice was carefully neutral. "Good money." "Steady work." Emma stared at him, trying to process what this meant. "And you're considering it?" "I was. My ranch isn't exactly thriving, and the money would solve a lot of problems." Caleb paused, then added quietly, "But I turned them down yesterday." "Why?" "Because some things matter more than money. This valley, this way of life, the people who are trying to preserve something real in a world that's increasingly fake." He looked at Emma directly. "Because I'd rather help you succeed at something meaningful than help them destroy something irreplaceable." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Emma felt her heart race as she realized they were talking about more than just business arrangements and land use policies. "Caleb," she began, not sure what she wanted to say. "I know it's complicated," he said quickly. "I know you're still figuring out your life, and I don't want to add pressure or expectations you're not ready for, but I also can't pretend that working with you these past months has been just about the animals in the ranch." Emma felt tears prick her eyes, though she couldn't have said whether they were from relief or fear or something else entirely. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I was married for 15 years to someone who made me feel small and useless. I don't know how to be in a relationship with someone who sees my strength instead of my weaknesses." "We don't have to figure it all out right now," Caleb said gently. "We can take it slow, see what develops naturally. No pressure, no expectations beyond what we already have." Emma thought about the easy partnership they developed over months of working together, the way he taught without condescending, the way he respected her growing competence while still offering support when she needed it. It was so different from her marriage that it felt almost too good to be true. "I'd like that," she said finally. "Taking it slow, seeing what happens." Caleb's smile was soft and genuine. "Good, because I've gotten pretty attached to having you around." As winter deepened into the darkest months of the year, Emma found herself settling into rhythms that felt increasingly natural. The morning and evening chores that had once seemed overwhelming now felt like meditation, quiet time to connect with the animals and the land. The physical demands that had left her exhausted now built strength and confidence. But it was the small moments between her and Caleb that began to mean the most. The way he brought her coffee on particularly cold mornings. The satisfaction in his eyes when she successfully handled a challenging situation on her own. The comfortable silences that developed between them as they worked side by side. Emma was learning that love didn't have to be dramatic or consuming to be real. Sometimes it was as simple as someone who showed up every day, who believed in your capability to grow and change, who saw your potential even when you couldn't see it yourself. The ranch was changing too, under Emma's increasingly confident care. She'd added improvements that reflected both practical needs and her growing understanding of what the animals needed to thrive. New shelters, better fencing, a more efficient milking setup that made daily chores easier and less stressful for both her and the goats. But the most important change was in Emma herself. The frightened, uncertain woman who'd arrived with nothing but a broken heart and a loyal dog was becoming someone she barely recognized, someone who could handle crises calmly, who made decisions based on knowledge and experience, who had earned the respect of her neighbors and the trust of the animals under her care. One snowy evening in February, as Emma and Caleb finished the evening milking, she realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd thought about Marcus or her old life in Seattle. That chapter felt like it had happened to someone else, a story she'd heard rather than lived. "Penny, for your thoughts," Caleb said, noticing her contemplative mood. "Just thinking about how different everything is now. How different I am." "Better different?" Emma considered the question seriously. She was definitely harder now, marked by physical work and real responsibility in ways that showed in her hands and her posture and the confident way she moved through the world. But she was also more herself than she'd ever been. "Much better," she said. "I like who I'm becoming." "I like who you're becoming too," Caleb said quietly, and in his voice Emma heard something that made her heart skip. As they walked toward the house together, Honey trailing behind after her own evening exploration, Emma felt a contentment that was deeper than happiness. This was home now, really home, in a way that no place had ever been before. And the man beside her was becoming something more than a teacher or a friend, or even a romantic interest. He was becoming the person she wanted to build this life with, day by day, season by season, year by year. Someone who would be there for the midnight crises and the daily routines and all the ordinary moments that made up a real life. The broken heart she'd arrived with had healed into something stronger, something capable of the kind of love that was built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than need or desperation or the desire to be rescued. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as every day did on a working ranch. But tonight, Emma fell asleep in Rose's bed, surrounded by the sounds of a world she'd learned to navigate, dreaming of spring and new growth and the endless possibilities that came with having finally found where she belonged. Spring arrived with a vengeance that tested everything Emma thought she'd learned about ranch management. The unseasonably warm March temperatures melted the snow faster than the ground could absorb it, turning the lower pastures into muddy swamps that trapped equipment and created hazardous conditions for both animals and humans. Emma stood knee-deep in brown water, wrestling with a fence post that had come loose in the soggy ground, when her phone rang with the call she'd been dreading for weeks. The veterinary clinic's number appeared on the screen, and Emma's heart sank as she answered with muddy hands. "Emma, it's Dr. Sarah Chen. I have the test results back on that blood work we ran on your herd." Emma had noticed several of the goats seeming lethargic and off their feed, symptoms subtle enough that she might have missed them entirely during her first months on the ranch. But Caleb had taught her to trust her instincts about the animals, and something had felt wrong enough to warrant professional consultation. "What did you find?" "CAE antibodies in 3 of your animals. Caprine, arthritis, and encephalitis. It's not immediately life-threatening, but it's contagious within the herd and there's no cure." Emma closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the diagnosis settle over her like a lead blanket. She'd read about CAE in her crash course on goat health, knew it meant difficult decisions about quarantine and potential culling, knew it could devastate her small operation if it spread through the entire herd. "What are my options?" "Separate the positive animals immediately. Test the entire herd and isolate anyone else who shows infection. You'll need to decide whether to cull the positive animals or maintain separate facilities for the rest of their lives. After Dr. Chen hung up, Emma sat in the mud and cried for the first time since Daisy's bloat crisis. Not from self-pity, but from the overwhelming weight of responsibility for decisions that affected living creatures who trusted her completely. Caleb found her there 20 minutes later, still sitting in the flooded pasture with tears streaming down her face. "Bad news from the vet?" he asked, settling beside her in the mud without regard for his clean clothes. Emma told him about the diagnosis, about the testing that would need to be done, about the heartbreaking choices ahead. Caleb listened without trying to minimize the problem or offer easy solutions. "This is what breaks people," Emma said finally. "Not the daily work or the financial pressure, but having to make life and death decisions for animals you've learned to love." "It is," Caleb agreed. "And it's also what separates real ranchers from people who are playing at ranch life. Anyone can feed animals when everything's going well. It takes someone special to make the hard choices when things go wrong." Over the next week, Emma lived through the most challenging period of her new life. The testing revealed 2 additional infected animals, including one of her best milking does. The quarantine procedures were complex and emotionally exhausting, requiring separate housing, feeding, and milking routines that doubled her daily workload. But what surprised Emma most was her own clarity about the difficult decisions. Without hesitation, she chose to maintain separate facilities rather than cull the infected animals. They would live out their natural lives in comfortable isolation, receiving the same quality care as the healthy herd but unable to rejoin the general population. "It's not the most economically efficient choice," she told Caleb as they finished building the additional fencing needed for the quarantine area. "But it's the right choice for you," he said, and Emma heard approval in his voice that meant more than any profit margin ever could. The crisis also revealed something else that Emma hadn't expected: the depth of support from her new community. When word spread about her herd health challenges, neighbors she barely knew appeared with offers of help. "You're playing house with farm animals and a cowboy who probably doesn't have 2 nickels to rub together. When you get tired of the novelty, what then?" Before Emma could respond, she heard the sound of Caleb's truck turning into her driveway. He parked and approached slowly, taking in the scene with sharp eyes but keeping his expression neutral. "Everything all right?" he asked, directing the question to Emma, but keeping his attention on Marcus. "Marcus was just leaving," Emma said, surprised by the calm certainty in her own voice. "Actually, I was hoping to talk to my wife privately," Marcus said, his tone carrying the authority he'd once used to control every aspect of Emma's life. "Ex-wife," Emma corrected, "and there's nothing private we need to discuss." Marcus's facade of reasonable concern began to crack. "Emma, be realistic. You can't seriously want to spend the rest of your life shoveling goat manure and pretending to be something you're not." The words should have stung, should have awakened all her old insecurities about her capabilities and worth. Instead, Emma felt a surge of protective anger that surprised her with its intensity. "You don't get to define who I am anymore," she said, her voice steady and strong. "You never did, actually. You just convinced me to define myself through your limitations instead of my own possibilities." Emma saw Caleb's slight smile at her words and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the spring evening. "And this is who you think you are?" Marcus gestured dismissively at her work clothes, at the ranch around them. "A farmer? A manual laborer? You have a college degree, Emma. You used to have standards." "I still have standards," Emma replied. "They're just different now. I value honesty over appearance, competence over connections, meaningful work over comfortable convenience." Marcus's expression hardened as he realized his usual tactics weren't working. "Fine. Play pioneer woman if that makes you happy. But don't expect me to be here when you come to your senses and realize you've wasted the best years of your life on this fantasy." After Marcus left, Emma and Caleb sat on the porch steps, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Honey lay contentedly between them, occasionally opening one eye to monitor their conversation. "You okay?" Caleb asked finally. Emma considered the question seriously. Seeing Marcus again should have been traumatic, should have awakened doubts about the choices she'd made and the life she was building. Instead, the encounter had crystallized everything she'd learned about herself over the past year. "Better than okay," she said, For the first time, I saw him clearly. Not as the man who had power over my life, but as someone who was actually much smaller and more frightened than I ever was. What do you mean? He's terrified of anything real, anything that might require him to grow or change or be vulnerable. He needs people around him to stay small so he can feel big. Emma leaned back against the porch post, feeling a peace she'd never experienced before. I used to think his confidence meant he was right about my limitations. Now I realize his need to diminish me was proof of his own insecurity. Caleb reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. You know what I see when I look at you? What? Someone who had the courage to bet everything on becoming her authentic self. Someone who chose growth over comfort, truth over convenience, meaningful work over empty security. His thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. Someone worth admiring. Emma felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than pain. I couldn't have done any of this without you. You could have, Caleb said firmly. You might have taken a different path, learned different lessons, but you would have found your way. The strength was always there, Emma. I just helped you discover it. As summer settled over the ranch, Emma found herself living with a contentment she'd never imagined possible. The quarantined animals were thriving in their separate facility. The healthy herd was producing abundant milk, and the pastures were green with new growth after the challenging spring. More importantly, her relationship with Caleb had evolved into something deeper than romance or partnership. They worked together with an efficiency born of understanding each other's strengths and compensating for each other's weaknesses. They challenged each other to grow, while providing the security of unconditional support. Emma was cleaning the milking equipment one evening when Caleb appeared with 2 glasses of iced tea and an expression that suggested he had something important on his mind. I've been thinking, he said, settling beside her on the barn steps. About what? About us. About the future. About whether you might be interested in making this partnership more official. Emma's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. What kind of official? Caleb set down his tea and turned to face her directly. The kind where we combine our ranches, pool our resources, build something bigger and better than either of us could manage alone. He paused, then added with a slight smile. And the kind where I get to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of our lives. Emma had been expecting this conversation, had been thinking about it herself as their relationship deepened and their professional partnership proved so successful. But hearing the words out loud still sent a thrill of possibility through her chest. Are you proposing to me, Caleb Morrison? I'm proposing that we build a life together. Marriage, combined operations, shared dreams, and shared responsibilities. His expression was serious but warm. I'm proposing that we prove Marcus wrong about what you're capable of by creating something extraordinary together. Emma thought about the woman who'd arrived at this ranch a year ago, broken and uncertain, and carrying nothing but pain and a loyal dog. That woman couldn't have imagined the conversation she was having now, couldn't have conceived of being worthy of the kind of love Caleb was offering. What would we call it? She asked, already knowing her answer but wanting to savor the moment. Sunset Creek Ranch, Caleb said immediately. Rose's name, but big enough for all of us. Emma leaned forward and kissed him, tasting possibility and promise and the sweet certainty of a future built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Yes, she whispered against his lips. To all of it. Yes. The wedding took place, 6 months later, in the barn, where Emma had learned to milk goats and Caleb had learned to love a city woman who'd surprised everyone, including herself, with her capacity for growth and commitment. Emma wore a simple white dress and boots that could handle barn floors, her hands adorned with both a wedding ring and the calluses that marked her as someone who did real work in the world. Caleb wore his best jeans and a shirt that brought out his eyes, looking like exactly what he was, a man who'd found his perfect partner for the adventure of building a meaningful life. The guest list included neighbors who'd become family, animals who'd been witnesses to Emma's transformation, and even Betty Morrison, who'd served as unofficial matchmaker and surrogate mother throughout the courtship. As they exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promising to support each other through midnight emergencies and daily routines, through successful seasons and challenging ones, Emma felt the last pieces of her broken heart knit themselves back together into something stronger than what she'd started with. "I promise to see your strength even when you can't see it yourself," she said, looking into Caleb's eyes. "I promise to build something beautiful with you, day by day, season by season, year by year." "I promise to be your partner in all things," he replied. "I promise to love not just who you are, but who you're still becoming." As they kissed to seal their commitment, surrounded by the community that had supported Emma's journey from broken city woman to confident ranch owner, Emma felt the profound satisfaction that came from having become exactly who she was meant to be. The goats bleated their approval from the adjacent pen, Honey barked her congratulations from the front row, and somewhere in the distance, the cattle lowed contentedly in the pastures Emma had learned to manage with competence and love. That night, as Mr. and Mrs. Morrison settled into the farmhouse that would now be their shared home, Emma looked out at the ranch that had become her salvation and her future. The animals were secure in their pens, the equipment was maintained and ready for tomorrow's work, and beside her lay the man who'd seen her potential when she couldn't see it herself. The broken heart she'd arrived with had healed into something capable of the deepest kind of love. The kind built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the daily choice to see the best in each other even during the hardest times. In choosing to stay and fight for something meaningful, Emma had discovered not just her own strength, but the kind of partnership that made both people better than they could ever be alone. She'd found her home, her work, her community, and her soulmate all in the same place. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as every day did on a working ranch. But tonight, Emma fell asleep surrounded by the sounds of a world she'd learned to navigate expertly, dreaming of the seasons ahead and the endless possibilities that came from having finally, completely, courageously chosen the life that was truly hers. The woman who'd arrived with nothing but a dog and a broken heart had become someone she could never have imagined. Strong, capable, beloved, and completely, authentically herself. And in the barn where 37 goats slept peacefully under her care, Daisy dreamed contentedly, safe in the knowledge that her human had learned exactly what it meant to love something enough to never give up. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.